In 1920, Terence McSweeney, the Lord Mayor of Cork, starved himself to death in Brixton Prison. He had protested at being treated as a common criminal by the British for his membership of the IRA. McSweeney wrote, "It is not those who inflict the most, but those who can suffer the most who will conquer." That philosophy of hunger strike as a weapon of protest has surfaced again and again in Anglo-Irish history. In 1981, it was to be put to its ultimate test. At the Maze prison in 1981, over 60 years after the death of McSweeney, 10 men convicted of terrorist offences starved themselves to death, an event still commemorated by Republicans in Belfast today. It was a unique drama watched by the world in disbelief. How could anyone starve to death for a cause? This film tells the hidden history of that hunger strike, with secrets from inside the government and the testimony of surviving strikers now out of prison.
I can remember the pain. It was just like the noise, firstly, in my head, you know, like a screeching noise, you know, going right through your head. And this pain in the back of the brain, at the base of the brain there. It just seemed, it was like, the only way I could describe it was like somebody rubbing your brain with a Brillo pad. That's what it felt like, you know, and it just got worse and worse.
Watching television, people on pleading, please don't let my son die, please don't let my husband die. I felt, well, that's all wrong, because my brother was murdered and my husband was murdered, but I didn't get a chance. Nobody allowed me to go and plead for their lives. They had no choice. They were young and they died, but they were murdered. Whereas with the hunger strike, it was suicide. I
don't think at any stage that hunger strikers went on hunger strike to die. In other words, they didn't sort of say to themselves, I'm going to die. The hunger strike was a weapon which was about raising the political stakes.
I think the issues of the hunger strike were very simple and clear. Were the IRA prisoners going to succeed in complete and total denial of law and order principles in this country? Who was going to govern the country? Was it going to be the elected government of the country, or were they going to be able, by blackmail and by the tactics of a hunger strike, make the British government surrender?
In 1972, Northern Ireland was on the brink of open civil war, and direct rule was imposed from London. At Belfast's Crumlin Road prison, 40 convicted Republicans staged a hunger strike, like Terence McSweeney, demanding political status. But this time, the government gave in. They conceded the prisoners their own clothes and free association, thus setting an important precedent by giving them political status in all but name.
It seemed at the time that probably this was a risk that was right to take, because the situation was so desperate. And it worked in the very short term, which of course, in a way, giving away to pressures does sometimes. But probably it may have been right at the time, and I would defend it on the basis that you can't make more difficulties than you already got when you're in a very desperate situation. But I equally think it was a mistake to do it, and it had to be reversed at some stage, and I accept that absolutely.
In 1976, the rules for dealing with terrorists in prison were changed again by the new Labour government, and Whitelaw's concessions were withdrawn. The H-blocks at the Maze prison were built to accommodate prisoners under the new regime. The new Republican prisoners refused to cooperate with the change. They rejected prison clothing as the badge of criminality and stayed naked except for a blanket. Jackie McMullen got life imprisonment for the attempted murder of an RUC officer and was one of the first IRA prisoners to arrive at the Maze after the rules changed.
you went on the blanket protest. Why did you feel that the public, say the British public, should feel sympathetic towards you? Because after all, you were convicted of terrorist offences.
Well, the initial reason wasn't to attract any sympathy, certainly not to attract any sympathy from the British public. Initially, I went on the blanket, and the other men went on the blanket just because we weren't going to conform. We were refusing to wear prison gear. We were refusing to do prison work. That was it. We didn't have any grand strategy laid out at that stage about mobilising sympathy or developing some sort of campaign outside. The initial thing was they were trying to make us wear prison uniforms and to do prison work, and we refused.
Well, is there such a thing as a political prisoner? If you went out and murdered someone tomorrow, you would be in court, you would be tried, you would be sentenced, and you would go to prison. But it wouldn't be called political because you're not a terrorist. So, I mean, to me, a murder is a murder. If you go out and you shoot somebody or you blow them up, it's murder. And I don't see anything political about murder.
The prison policy, when I was there, was involved in the theory of criminalisation, which was brought in by the previous government, by the socialist government. It's a perfectly logical policy. In practice, the prisoners were treated as political prisoners. They were segregated from each other. All sorts of fudging arrangements were made on a day-to-day basis, which couldn't be acknowledged publicly.
It was this lack of public acknowledgement of the secret reality which led to a hardening of attitudes on both sides.
Basically, they were the enemy and we were the enemy to them, and it was a hate-hate relationship, because at the same time staff were getting killed outside, and so that heightened the tension inside. They weren't dealing with individual prisoners, they were dealing with an army inside the prison. And not only that, they were dealing with the army's backup outside the prison. And you're talking about the provisional IRA outside. It wasn't Mickey Mouse, it was big stuff.
The blanket protest quickly escalated into the so-called dirty protest, with prisoners refusing to wash and covering their cell walls and floors with the contents of their slopping out bowls. By 1980, after 4 years of the dirty protest and with no response from the new Thatcher government, the Republican prisoners were becoming desperate. The IRA's commanding officer in the H blocks, Brendan Hughes, took the decision to call a hunger strike to bring things to a head. A close associate of Hughes was 24-year-old Pat McGEOWN, serving a 15-year sentence for his part in bombing a Belfast hotel.
You know, it was always the case that hunger strike would be the eventual conclusion of the prison protest. If it didn't resolve itself after 3 or 4 years of fighting it out, sooner or later, you know, it's a sort of traditional thing in Ireland, sooner or later prison protest arrives at the life and death issue of hunger strike.
The strikers formalized their aims into 5 demands, including the right to wear their own clothes and the right to associate with one another in the prison. After 54 days, with Mrs. Thatcher sounding conciliatory and one of the strikers close to death, the prisoners called off the hunger strike. They believed, through intermediaries, that the British government was about to make concessions. But they misread the signals. It quickly became apparent that they had no deal.
The first one ended with negotiation and no deaths. In fact, it was Bobby Sands that negotiated the end of that first hunger strike, unsuccessfully for him, and that's why he was the first one to go on the second one.
Bobby Sands said, it's like this. He called us all up the door. He says, like this, we're not giving in like this. We're not letting this go. We're not letting them off with this. He says, there's going to be another hunger strike, and I'm going to lead it. And they'll be calling for volunteers to go on this hunger strike. So that's the way it happened.
Screws and that used to believe that we were ordered on hunger strike, but the answer to that is, and what if you refuse? What are we going to do? No, somebody going to say to you, starve yourself to death, or else, you know. So there was no question of it.
Our people on the outside strongly advised against the second hunger strike. As a matter of fact, they actually at one stage sort of said, look, we don't want you to go on hunger strike. We're being very blunt about it. We don't want it. And we pondered over those few weeks, just sort of throwing about the options. But in the end, after consultation, the general consensus was there should be a second hunger strike.
Sands asked to see Father Dennis Fall, a Catholic priest who regularly held Mass at the Maze and who had spoken out publicly on the prisoners' behalf during the dirty protest.
We had a very long discussion over an hour about the morality of the hunger strike. I thought it would have very disastrous effects. First of all, the strain on his own family and relations would be terrible. And secondly, it would have a very serious effect on the community. And I said, you know, it's a very serious matter, put your life in danger, and only a great serious reason can be brought forward for that. And we discussed that at some length, and then he said, greater love than this no man has, than a man lays down his life for his friends. Well, I says, Bobby, there's really no arguing with that. But I knew from his resolution and from what he had said to me that he would never change unless the British came in and negotiated with him directly.
A Republican prisoner at the Maze prison in Northern Ireland refused breakfast this morning and says he will fast to the death to achieve his aim of political status. Bobby Sands, who's 27, is serving a 14-year jail sentence for firearms offences.
We realised the potential after the first hunger strike. When you had 7 people all drawn to death at the one stage, the impact wouldn't be any less than one person going to death. No, we actually sort of seen that because the media were then trying to cope with 7 different individuals, whereas actually when you had one individual, that individual could become human. So rather than commit 7, 8 or 9 at one time, what we'll do is we'll commit them in a phased way. And also by virtue of that, it means that if one died and the other one wasn't due to reach that stage until 2 weeks, it gave the British government a chance to manoeuvre. So it was planned to that degree.
So, 2 weeks after Sands began his hunger strike, he was joined by a second striker, followed by 2 more men a week later. And the campaign received a further massive public boost when Sands agreed to stand as a candidate in a by-election for the constituency of Fermanagh and South Tyrone.
Robert Sands has turned out to be the only candidate from the nationalist, or to put it more crudely, the Catholic side in the race. If he wins, there's no question that it'll be a major propaganda victory for the IRA and the H-Block's campaign. But if he were to lose, it'd be because Catholic voters in the constituency, rather than see a convicted IRA man get elected, they'd be prepared to see a hardliner from the Protestant side winning the seat.
Everybody voted for Bobby Sands because we wanted to save his life. It was as simple as that. Sinn Féin said they were borrowing the seat in Fermanagh, South Tyrone, in order to save Bobby Sands' life.
I believe that every vote that is put into the ballot box for an IRA Sinn Féin candidate is a vote for the gun and the bullet and the bomb, and also is a vote against the Protestant population.
Sands, Bobby, anti-H-Block, Armagh, political prisoner, 30,492. I declare that Bobby Sands has been duly elected to serve as a member for the...
8 days after his election, Sands received the last rites. An emissary from the Pope left him with a golden crucifix, and a succession of intermediaries could do nothing to persuade either Sands or Mrs. Thatcher to give in.
I'd been in the H-Blocks from 1978 and therefore didn't know Mrs. Thatcher. We had no TV, we had no radio, we had no access to newspapers, so we didn't know who Margaret Thatcher was. We had heard of her, of course, but essentially we didn't know the character of the woman.
Crime is crime is crime. It is not political, it is crime. And there can be no question of granting political status. I just hope that anyone who is on hunger strike for his own sake will think fit to come off hunger strike, but that is a matter for him.
In spite of Mrs. Thatcher's apparent intransigence, the government's hard line was wavering. according to a senior civil servant in the government's Northern Ireland office at Stormont Castle.
I was one of 6 people on the Northern Ireland Office Committee which ran the hunger strike day and night. The others included the head of the prison service and a man from MI5. We were in constant contact with the Cabinet Office in Whitehall. We offered advice, they'd take the political decisions. On the eve of Sands' death, there was a definite weakening in London. They thought that the game was not worth the candy, whereas we knew that it was. Failure meant that the prison service would be sold down the river and that the provost would then control it. And we knew that if we were beaten on this one, we were done. We threatened to resign if they caved in. And I had a feeling that we swung the government's attitude around in the end.
The resolve was a totally clear resolve for everybody concerned in the British government, there's no doubt. And I think, on the whole, supported by the Labour Party in opposition. So it was a pretty united view, as we couldn't give way to a hunger strike once it had got to that stage.
The place is Twinbrook, West Belfast, the home of Bobby Sands. In the last hour, the news has filtered through to this community that Bobby Sands has died after 66 days of hunger strike.
It hit us very hard when Bobby died, but there was still that determination to go on, not to give in. Especially with his death, we decided, like, we can't give up now. To let him die. The reason they let him die was to break the rest of us.
100,000 people, 1/5 of the Catholic population of the province, attended Sands' funeral. The drama was played out in front of the world's press and television, but the government's position remained unchanged.
We have seen today the funeral of a man who took his own life, either by his own decision or because those behind him felt it was in the interest of their cause that he should die. And we shall shortly see, and the event deserves no less publicity, the funeral of Constable Ellis, a police officer who was murdered yesterday in Belfast in the course of his duties.
The IRA kill people. Therefore, why should we feel sympathetic when they set out to mount a campaign in the prison to change their prison conditions?
Well, I suppose it's hard to say whether, I don't know if we were ever looking for people to be sympathetic as such. I think what we were looking for people to do was to take a political decision, that either that there was a way to resolve the prison issue without death, or else you could run ahead and there was a certainty to be death. So therefore, I don't think it was much actually asking people to be sympathetic. It was rather asking them, it was rather creating a crisis situation where they had to take a political decision.
As the condition of the hunger strikers deteriorated, staff who worked in the prison hospital inevitably became involved.
There was a sort of truce in the hospital. It was neutral territory. I knew why they were in there and what they had done. You had some staff who treated them as animals, but I didn't see it like that. I put what they'd done at the back of my mind. I got a different response from them then. The hardest thing to do was to serve them their breakfast. The prison service had to feed them, otherwise the public would say that we were starving them. The prisoners knew that I knew that they wouldn't touch it, but I still had to do it.
And so 3 more strikers died in the month after Sands' death, each one followed by a wave of protest rioting.
Four prisoners have taken their own lives deliberately. I do not know of any religious leader or politician who is urging me to give political status. Not one.
But in spite of appearances, Mrs. Thatcher did have her problems. The death of Sands and his colleagues had damaged Britain's image internationally, particularly in America, where British ships were subject to a boycott in US ports. There were even threats of trade sanctions.
Although Thatcher had always been in this position of never, 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 We understood British politics, that if it suited, and if the issue became too hard to handle, that they would talk, they would negotiate. And what we considered that was the stage we'd arrived at. The hunger strike was an embarrassment internationally to Britain, so there were sort of pros and cons on both sides for finding the settlement. And we actually discussed at that stage how we would end the hunger strike before Joe McDonnell would die.
In late June, with Joe McDonnell approaching death and signals that the prisoners were prepared to be flexible, the junior Northern Ireland Office Minister, Michael Allison, was approached by a respected Catholic human rights body, the Irish Commission for Justice and Peace.
We were a very naive group of people. We must have seen Mr. Allison and his advisors 5 or 6 times from the first time that we met him in Hillsborough Castle, and then we were several times in and out to the Maze prison. And we felt all the time that we were trying to harden up on the reality of the discussions we were having. Initially, there were vague possibilities. We saw possibilities in our minds, but we weren't sure how real these might be.
Meanwhile, in Dublin, there was a general election, which resulted in 2 of the hunger strikers winning seats in the Irish Parliament. The new Prime Minister was Dr. Garret FitzGerald.
We came into office on the 30th of June. Within a day or so, we had reason to believe that the prisoners' position was differentiated from that of the IRA, and that they might agree to arrangements which would fall short of political status and not involve giving in to the IRA demands. This seemed to us very hopeful indeed as a way out of the whole problem, and we were strongly supportive of the hierarchy, Irish hierarchy's Commission for Justice and Peace, who were seeking to put these points to the British Minister for State, Allison, in Belfast. We had reason to believe that agreement could be reached, and was on the point of being reached.
We were picked up by a gentleman in a blue car who took us around a lot of streets and brought us to a house where Gerry Adams was. And we had a discussion with him, in the course of which he was able to tell us very, very precisely the propositions that we had been making and the propositions that the British representatives had been making to us. And we were utterly shocked at that, because it was quite clear that he couldn't have that information. We hadn't told him. Gerry Adams had told us that he had a direct contact with London, or I thought he said via the Foreign Office, that he had a contact that he was able to make. And while we were carrying on a public discussion, and while Margaret Thatcher and the British administration were saying to us that they couldn't negotiate with criminals and they couldn't negotiate with hunger strikers, simultaneously they were carrying on direct conversations with Gerry Adams and his people, and we found that very, very shocking indeed.
What was the British government up to? Some clues are to be found in a parallel situation in December 1980, during the ending of the first hunger strike. John Hume was playing a similar role to the Commission for Justice and Peace and attempting to mediate between the prisoners and the government. Agreement seemed near.
I assumed that I was the only person who was talking to them, because I was talking on behalf. I had spoken to the spokesperson for the hunger strikers, and he told me specifically what would settle it. And that's what I specifically put to Mr. Atkins, which conformed with the specific proposal that I had been publicly making for some time, arising out of the situation. And I rang the Secretary of State, and he told me, "Oh, I'm sorry, we got your proposals." Although in my discussions with him, I had the very clear impression that he accepted them. But I then discovered, on turning on the news, that someone else had gone into the prison.
So, whilst John Hume was seen publicly to be mediating, who was the person who played such a covert role at the end of the first hunger strike? Time Watch tracked him down. He gave an in-depth interview, but wishes to remain anonymous. He is a clergyman. His code name was the Angel. He gave convincing evidence that the government was negotiating directly with the IRA during the first and second hunger strikes. For 2 years prior to the first strike, he acted as a go-between with the IRA and the government. In December 1980, he was asked by his IRA contacts to collect a government document from Belfast Airport and take it to the IRA and then the prison. His contact at the airport was a government agent, codenamed the Mountain Climber. The Mountain Climber was believed to be a Catholic businessman and a Foreign Office contact. The Angel told us that during the crucial stage in the second hunger strike, he was with Gerry Adams. Adams was talking directly on the phone to the mountain climber, who was relaying the government's position to him. Although Gerry Adams declined to take part in this film, Republican sources confirmed the Angel's story. Government sources are more equivocal.
I never knew that the Foreign Office were changing their view, though there may have been feelers going out to see what was thought. And of course, I suppose there was, again, always the American pressure, which was not quite as real or as strong as some people used to make out, but still there were those who thought that the British government ought to give some ground.
The fifth hunger striker, Joe McDonnell, died on the 61st day of his fast, and the Irish Commission for Justice and Peace announced that the British government had not delivered the deal they'd hoped for.
I have not said that the British government lied.
But you are implying they went back on their word.
I'm saying that they assert that Mr. Allison acted in good faith and that all day yesterday there was a clawing back on the part of the British government.
It takes a bit of time to formulate a proposal or a set of ideas which are clear-cut and balanced and reasonable, and this had to take its natural time course. We couldn't, in other words, gear everything to the unknown length of time which a particular man might have to live. Sad that it is to say so.
Looking back, was it absolutely clear to you from your discussions with the Commission that the British government had been dealing directly with the IRA?
That was not in doubt, although I have to say I didn't know it at the time, and the Commission did not want to say this on the telephone to me for obvious reasons. And it was only some time later, about a week later, that we heard what had happened. But to intervene and approach the IRA directly, making them an additional offer when there was a negotiation going on, which was bringing things to a conclusion, was about the stupidest thing anybody could have possibly done.
Amidst the confusion of two sets of negotiations, one open and the other secret, nothing was resolved. And back inside the maze, Pat McGEOWN decided to replace Joe McDonnell as the next striker, even though he had long held doubts about the hunger strike.
When you take a decision to go on hunger strike, you have a very intense argument because you're talking about your life, you're talking about you passing on. Whenever you watch other people die around you, you're talking about their lives, people that you know so very close, people that you actually sort of have spent so much time with that you know them better than your family. And all that raises a sense of balancing. You know, is it worth it or isn't it? Is there another way or is this the only way?
Another of the new hunger strikers was 24-year-old Lawrence McEwen.
I guess you get into the hunger strike. It's not as if offence take over, but you're there, you've agreed to do that job, and now you're in the middle of it, and it's happening, and it's sort of, maybe to an extent, you actually feel it's happening around you, because you're not physically doing anything other than refusing to eat food.
In the 4 months since the hunger strike began, 19 more members of the security forces had been killed in Northern Ireland. A group of widows of policemen led by Marlene Wilson felt their views were being ignored.
We didn't really choose to speak out until we saw the publicity given to the hunger strikers. And it seemed to be worldwide. And we felt that they had a choice which our husbands, sons, daughters didn't have. They can choose to live or die. My husband and my brother were never given that chance. We believe in peace too, but we want peace with law and order and justice. My husband was blown up, the car was booby-trapped, my brother was shot dead. By the IRA, I mean, they claimed it immediately. And these were the same people who were in there in hunger strike, not perhaps exactly the people who had murdered my brother and my husband, but a lot of them had murdered people, and yet they were being given a choice.
Well, as far as we were concerned, like, we had no other choice. We were put into the situation by the British government. They were using us to criminalise our struggle for freedom. They put us in the forefront. And that's why we were in that situation. And we didn't see ourselves as having any choice.
They decided to die, and their parents allowed them. My parents didn't get the chance to go on and plead for my brother, nor did my husband's parents, and I didn't get a chance to plead for their lives.
By late July, with no signs of a change and 6 men dead, the hunger strikers in the next wave were starting to deteriorate.
I think it was around about maybe 40 days that I was started to get double vision, very clear vision, but it's double. But then went into like a hazy vision, and then after that, like a twitching of the eyeballs, which means the whole sight is very much blurred. The hearing would also have been affected, like a fuzziness in it.
What you had was you were vomiting, but you had nothing in your body to vomit. You know, we were recommended to drink 4 pints of water per day. But when you vomited, what you end up was taking up like a very thick green bile. So you had just a retching of vomiting, and it was continuous every time you drank. This would come back up. You just weren't holding down water. And at the same token, just the pain of your body, which is so weak already, having to go through that retching. And your eyesight began to go, hearing began to go, and speech began to slur. So you sort of, you knew that you were in serious trouble.
They seek to work on the most basic of human emotions, pity, as a means of creating tension and stoking the fires of bitterness and hatred. In doing so, the Provisional IRA have put the Catholic community on the rack. And my heart goes out to all those there who are finding themselves in an increasingly intolerable position.
It was very hard going in because every time you knew he was going to be worse, looking worse.
Did you try and persuade him to come off it then?
Oh, I did. Well, he wouldn't listen to you. Just, we mightn't, then it annoyed him so much that you just didn't mention it anymore. He gets so upset about it.
I think I just got maybe lost the rag after a while and telling me to get out. All I could see either back me or back Maggie Thatcher. I think that was more or less the end of that visit.
Well, I think once it had been decided to stand firm against the hunger strike, that you had to go on and go right through with it. There could really be no going back on that once one had got to that stage. And I think we just had to take that view.
You weren't influenced at all by the thoughts of the families?
Well, of course you must be so. It would be human if you weren't. But I think in the end, once you've got so far in a decision like that, you have to harden your heart.
Behind the orchestrated public show of the funerals, some of the parents of the dead strikers had faced a stark private dilemma. They had been told that they had the legal right to intervene to save their sons' lives at the point they reached unconsciousness.
I knew that the families were the Achilles heel, so to speak, and asked my family over and over to give me a guarantee that they would support me and that I wouldn't have to worry about them weakening or in any way undermining the hunger strike.
I've been talking to most of the families from early on in the hunger strike, from March. The families did not want to be used as levers by the Provisional Sinn Féin to obtain political power or by the IRA to obtain support. They knew, but they wouldn't say that publicly. They didn't have the opportunity to say it. They were being manipulated in a very brutal and not even in a cunning fashion, but in an openly brutal fashion. I knew the families didn't want their sons to die. And I organised a meeting of the relatives for the Tigers Hotel in Toon Bridge. Now, I think the Lynches, the 2 Lynch boys were here, the 2 Lynch sons of Mrs. Lynch, brothers of Kevin. I think they were sitting here. And Mrs. Quinn and her son from South Armagh, they were sitting over here. I think Bernadette Devlin, who was related to Matt Devlin, she was sitting there. And I think the McGEOWNs were sitting in that corner. That's Mr. and Mrs. McGEOWN, the parents of Lawrence McGEOWN. The meeting was quiet and thoughtful because there were 3 men dying at the time, Paddy Quinn, Kevin Lynch and Kieran O'Doherty. I presented the facts as I saw them, namely that there were 6 men dead, that Cardinal O'Fee's visit to Mrs. Thatcher, along with Bishop James Lennon on the 1st of July, indicated that she would let 20 more die. I was afraid that men were being put on the hunger strike who were not able to stand up to it and had to be taken off, or who died very quickly, as Martin Hurston did. And that I was beginning to fear that the weapon of protest was changing from the fast to death and big public funerals. That would not be ethical or moral according to the teaching of the Catholic Church. It was the unanimous decision of all the people in this room on the evening of the 28th of July 1981 that the hunger strike should be ended. That Sinn Féin should be asked to go in and take them off, or we would, the relatives, would take them off, would take them off one by one. There was no dissension, unanimous decision. They rang for Gerry Adams. They asked him would he come up here. He couldn't come for security reasons. So we said we would go down to Belfast.
We arrived at the Sinn Féin office on the Falls Road about 10 to 1 in the morning. Then there was a noisy meeting. There was a lot of arguments on one thing and the other. And what we thought he could do, maybe he couldn't, was to tell them, you know, that it wasn't going to, Maggie Thatcher was never going to give in to them, and it was just one hunger striker day and after another.
It was said to him, go in and use whatever powers of persuasion you have, in whatever you think is the best way to do it, to get them off. And it should have been obvious to him that the only way to get them off is to bring them together as a group and order them off as a group. Surely Sinn Féin and the IRA between them, they should have had enough noose in their heads to achieve that.
I can remember Gerry Adams coming in. I remember being at the meeting. I was on the wheelchair at the time. Well, my eyes was gone that stage and I couldn't really see him, only could see, you know, the outline. He says, yous all can come off the hunger strike now. Each and last one. He's just ended now. It was your decision to go on hunger strike. Yous know that. And it's your decision to come off it. After Gerry said these things, Tom McElwee took charge. He says, do you want to come off the hunger strike? I says, no. Then he went round the rest, and they all said no. It was after that meeting when I was come back that all fear of death, I had no more fear of death after that meeting.
Paddy Quinn started to hyperventilate. Horrible roaring and screaming. I had to put a brown paper bag over his face to reduce the oxygen intake.
I remember seeing the bag, like a plastic bag, just getting a glimpse of it. And I just seen it like in slow motion, you know, coming down over my face. And then things, you know, going black, this thing. And then feeling that choking if somebody had you by the throat and you could hear the noise in your throat, struggling for breath. And that just continued. The pain would start again, then the choking would start, the pain, the choking. It went on and on.
When we went in, he wasn't fit to talk or anything, you know. And we didn't stay too long. I had my mind made up, I sort of think then. And I come out and I said to the doctor, what chance has he? And he says he'd have about a 50-50 chance. But I says I want him off the hunger strike. Eugene says, are you sure about this? He says, should you not see the rest of the family? John or Lawrence or somebody. So I says, no. There's no time for that. So we were taken into another room and they said the ambulance was sent for, and they give him something then, injections, I think. We had to sign the form first. We both had to sign the form, so then we got cups of tea, and I thought that ambulance would never come.
Paddy Quinn was rushed from the prison to hospital. 2 days after his mother took him off the strike, he regained consciousness.
I went in, and he says, Paddy says, "You signed the paper?" I says, "Yes." And I says to him, "Are you not happy? Are you not glad to be alive this morning?" And he says, "I don't know whether I am or not." And he was in very bad form. Went down that evening again. And as soon as I went in, he put out his hand and he says, "Mum," he says, "I'm sorry if I upset you this morning. It is good to be alive."
The families were now under pressure, and the hunger strikers were under pressure, and the whole thing had become really like a battle, or turned into a battle between the families and the hunger strikers, which no one ever wanted in the first place.
The day after Paddy Quinn came off, the 7th striker, Kevin Lynch, died after 71 days, followed by the 8th man, Kieran Doherty, who died the following day. Tom McElwee died on the 8th of August. 2 weeks later, Mickey Devine died. On the same day, Pat McGEOWN went into a coma, and his wife asked for medical intervention.
I remember saying to her, "Well, look, we'll have to work it out between us, but, well, I don't know, just leave it." And it was left at that, you know.
Did you feel angry or relieved?
A mixture, you know, because on the one hand, you know it was probably that close to death, but on the other hand, sort of saying, you know, have I let people down around me?
I think after 3 or 4 people had been taken off it, somewhere on the periphery of your mind, it did start entering the scene, the possibility that the hunger strike wasn't going to go on for too much longer.
When it was getting towards 9 and 10 deaths, we were saying, great, this is going on, you know, let's see if there's more can go, you know. But at the same time, we were saying to ourselves, look, it can't go on because the government is going to be embarrassed.
In the 7th month of the hunger strike, Jim Pryor was appointed by Mrs. Thatcher as Northern Ireland Secretary in place of Humphrey Atkins. The new junior minister responsible for prisons was a man who had been brought up in Ireland, Lord Gowrie.
Now, privately, I knew, because I know Mrs. Thatcher well, that she was very concerned about the situation, and when I asked to go, she said that if I could help in any way, she'd be terribly grateful. And I did go, and I did try to help. Now, we ended the hunger strike. By the time I got there, and Jim Pryor, my boss, got there, it was winding down. And the important work had been done not by us, but by the families, and by Dennis Fall, particularly, and others. So I'm claiming no credit of any kind, but nevertheless we were able to give it a push and bring a terrible deadlock to an end.
Republican prisoners on hunger strike in the Maze prison near Belfast have announced that they're ending their protest. A statement sent out of the...
Now let me make it absolutely clear as I say a word about the hunger strike. No concessions have been made to the IRA, and there will be certainly no perpetration of anything which looks like concessions to those who commit violence.
After 217 days and 10 deaths, it seemed to the public at first that the government had won the hunger strike. But had they? For, as our researchers have uncovered, secret discussions were going on with the Northern Ireland office, the NIO, throughout.
The NIO would try and dispute the fact that there was negotiations taking place between the so-called OCs and COs of the provies in the prison. But in fact, those interviews were taking place. prisoners were removed from their cells in the dead of night and taken down to prison hospital to enter negotiations with the NIO, both just before the hunger strike and during the hunger strike. And as far as their demands went, okay, during the hunger strike, no demands were met, but after the hunger strike, almost immediately after the hunger strike, every demand they asked for was met.
The fact is that 3 days later, the government did grant virtually all the hunger strikers' demands, most significantly giving them the right to wear their own clothes and have free association. Time watchers discovered that the IRA were assured that as soon as the hunger strikers stopped their protest, these concessions would be granted. So, perhaps the government were not as intransigent as they appeared.
Most of the issues that the strike were about were always concedable, but they weren't to be conceded under pressure. And that is what I think the disagreement with Mrs. Thatcher particularly is about. It was felt that she might have agreed to something that she would have agreed anyway, or that was the state anyway, in order to end the strike sooner. Her view, which I think from her perspective was a wholly credible one, was that that would have been of major consequence to the English state, and she was not prepared to negotiate under those bases. Other prime ministers might have been.
Concessions or not, some members of the Northern Ireland office saw it as at least a partial victory for the government.
We had to break the concept of hunger strike, break it once and for all. That much we did. And although in the end we lost the actual battle, we were a step closer to winning the war, because we had wrecked the idea of hunger strike as a weapon to be used against us.
I think in the end, history will show that we won, if there's such a thing as winning at that price, but we won. But it will take time for that to come through. And, you know, the price is so high, I think it shows the intensity of feeling of rightness that those people feel whenever they're prepared to pay prices like that.
Violence to the self, however courageous, and I've got into trouble in my political career for paying tribute to the courage of the young men who starve themselves to death. It's a nasty thing to do, and I have always acknowledged that courage. But violence to the self is violence. There is violence on the nationalist side, there's violence on the loyalist side. There has been violence committed by the security forces. We all know that. The problem in Ireland is how to break a cycle of violence.